From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of all my colleagues, in particular Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, who's Chief of the African and Middle East Division, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Joan Weeks. I'm head of the Near East section, the sponsor of today's program. And we're very pleased to present this titled, Us and Them, Breaking Free from Cultural Branding and Identity Politics. Before we start today's program and introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview about our collections and the hopes that you'll come back and use them. This speaker today is writing about Iranian Americans, and I did a quick search in our catalog and found 43 books on that topic, and some of them are in Persian and some of them are in English. So you're welcome to come back into our reading room and please use our collections for your future enjoyment and for the research. We are a custodial division and we build collections and serve these to researchers from around the globe. We cover over 78 countries and more than 24 languages. The Africa section includes all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, and we're going to have a follow-on program to this, so please stay if you can to hear our program on the Conversations with African Poets that'll immediately follow this program. And we also have the Hebraic section that covers Judaica and Hebraica worldwide. And our Near East section covers all of the Arab countries, including North Africa, Turkey, Turkic Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, and the Muslims in Western China, Russia, and the Balkans. So it's a very extensive research collection area. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We'd like to have you know that if you ask questions, this program is being videotaped, so implicitly you're giving us permission to videotape you. And also, we have flyers available if you're interested in our blog or Facebook. If you subscribe to the Facebook, you'll hear about other future programs as well. So without further ado, though, I'd like to invite my colleague, Hirad Dinavari, who's our Persian specialist, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on a difficult traffic day, from what I hear. It's wonderful to have our speaker here today. This would be her second book that she would be covering at LC. We loved her so much with the first book that we've invited her for her new book, which is a very timely book on immigrants living in different countries, essentially. I will do a short bio, although she really doesn't need a bio. She's well known. Ms. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani grew up in Uganda, was educated in the United Kingdom, and then in the United States, and now lives in France. She is the author of The Woman Who Read Too Much, which was a book on the poetess and woman leader, if you like, Tahireh Qurratul Ain, a 19th century icon. Also, she's written The Saddlebag. Her novels have been published in French, Italian, Spanish, German, Greek, Turkish, Hebrew, Russian, Korean, and Chinese. And I hope to this Persian and Arabic soon will be added as well. A nice quote from one of her books is, "We abandon our true homeland when we cannot identify with others." I think that captures the essence of this talk. And instead of me blabbing on, I would love to have Bahiyyih herself entice you with her wonderful wisdom and her book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It would have been fun to hear him blabbing on rather than me blabbing on. But I would first like to begin with all my gratitude to Mary Jane Deeb, to the Near Eastern Section, African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress, to Joan Weeks for her kind introduction, and above all, to dear Hirad for his generosity in maintaining correspondence with me all through this last couple of years. I've been delighted to hear from him. I've given the title of Breaking Free from Cultural Branding because of something which happened last year in Britain. And you have had your elections here, and this is certainly not a political discussion, but it affected me deeply when I heard Theresa May saying in October last year that citizens of the world were citizens of nowhere. And it really struck me because she was speaking about a very particular elite who are well represented in capitals like Washington, with the international institutions. I live in Strasbourg, where there are also international elites, if you like, in Europe, and there is a kind of gap between such people and the ordinary people in the street. That is certainly the case. But I was thinking of all the billions of people who are not international elite, who also find themselves as citizens of the world. And to be told that you're a citizen of nowhere when you are a refugee, when you have gone through harrowing conditions of war, of famine, of deprivation, and finally find yourself stripped of everything, seemed to me to be the last gesture of ravage. It didn't seem fair. So it occurred to me that one of the reasons why we're so worried about being labeled one way or another is because we are looking for labels, and maybe people think that to be called a citizen of the world is a threat. So we try to undermine it because of the rise of nationalism that we see in the world today, because of the extreme xenophobia, perhaps like in a previous age where anyone who seemed to be cosmopolitan, the word cosmopolitan became a slur in the 1930s. Cosmopolitanism became something like globalism, and it was considered a threat to the nationalism of the times. I thought maybe we could look at the real meaning behind a citizen of the world and see it as an inclusive kind of identity, see it as a way of bringing people together rather than imposing walls between them. Citizens of the world, and those of us that don't necessarily carry one name label, that have a brand which seems to be multiple, very often find ourselves sort of without a singular identity. And it seems that part of the reason I needed to write this book was because of the fracturing of identity that I've noticed in the Iranian diasporan community. We're not just one group of people, we're multiple. We seem to have identities that also reflect the cultures and the countries in which we find new homes. So I've set this story in a kind of ping-pong world between the French Iranian world and the American Iranian world. And I follow the life of the old lady who has emerged from Iran almost by accident, really, not by desire. She had wanted to stay in her country, which I think is the case for most refugees and migrants. It isn't an act necessarily of choice. And she finds herself rather like a benign King Lear bouncing between two daughters. Now, my two daughters are certainly nothing like Goneril and Regan. They have every reason, and maybe Goneril and Regan did too, for having chips on their shoulders. But we see their lives through the lives of the old lady. We see her through their eyes. So we're given a chance to look at the Iranian coming from Iran from the point of view of the diasporan Iranian. And we look at the diasporan daughters from the point of view of the Iranian mother. Ever since I started writing, people have called me an Iranian writer. And I don't see how I could possibly be called an Iranian writer if I grew up in East Africa. I don't see how I can also be called an Iranian writer if I'm not living in Iran, talking about Iran today. I've written about Iran in the 19th century, which is not what Iran is now. And so I realized I had to write a story about what I knew, which was the experience of being outside Iran, and not only outside from one perspective, but since I've lived in several countries myself, and since I've met the Iranian diaspora all over the place, I wanted to capture something of that diversity, that fragmentation. The title, the cover of this book is interesting because it reflects broken glass. It reflects fractured glass. It reflects prisms of mirror or glass that are not just giving you one image, but are giving you different facets of the image and of the light. And I'm particularly pleased with the cover because of an interesting quote that I discovered by James Joyce. As you know, he had difficulty publishing Ulysses, but he also had difficulty publishing Dubliners. And it took him something like 9 years before the book came out. And in the process, in his frustration, he wrote the following. Now I've lost it. 1 second. Here we are. He wrote to his publisher saying, "I seriously believe that you will retard the course of civilization in Ireland by preventing the Irish people from having a good look at themselves in my nicely polished looking glass." Now, looking glasses and mirrors are something that the Iranians absolutely love. You can't go to an Iranian house without seeing reflections of yourself and everybody else on all sides. But I think particularly fragmented glass is something very intimately associated with Iranian culture. They have a way of making the most remarkable mosaics out of pieces of broken mirror. And I've often wondered whether they first have to break the mirror in order to make the mosaic, or whether there's so much shattered glass all over the place that they have found creative ways of using it. But in any event, broken mirrors, fractured mirrors, balls of broken glass reflecting refracted rays of light is a metaphor very close to the Iranian psyche, I thought. And since I have no pretensions of writing a book that could retard the course of civilization if it was not read by the Iranians, I thought it best to present a fractured vision of this community. I've done it in several ways. One is because it's simply the subject matter is fractured. It's about a scattering of people all over the world. But I've also chosen a narrative structure which is reflecting that fragmentation. So you will find in this story the thread of the lives of the mother and her two daughters, the King Lear thread, which I vaguely described, the story of the mother going from one country to the other, meeting the French daughter, meeting the American daughter, and her own experiences in between. And between the chapters which tell you the story of Bibi John and her daughter Lily in France, and her daughter Goli in America, and her yearning and aching heart for her absent son who disappeared during the Iran-Iraq war as a young boy of 14 with the keys of paradise around his neck, Ali, who has never been found, who has never been confirmed dead or alive, and who hovers all the way through this story as a sort of yearned for Messiah figure, a kind of promised Qa'em who may or may not ever come. He's dangling in the story all the way through. So Bibi, Goli, Lily, I'll say it again. Bibi, the mother, Lily, the French daughter, Goli, the American daughter, Goli's daughter, Delhi, because the Persians absolutely love ending names in the family, either with the same vowel or starting them with the same set of consonants, and Ali, who is the absent son. Between the chapters that tell you the story of this somewhat dysfunctional family, I have fragmented images of Persians from all over the world. So you go in and out of the story by meeting fragments of other Iranians in different countries all over the planet. And I explain why I've done that in the first chapter, which is called Us. In this chapter, I define the meaning of that first-person plural narration. Who is the us that is taking us into these different chapters? And I start off by saying that we were waiting for this book to come out for quite some time, and it doesn't come out. We keep waiting for it. We keep looking for it. It doesn't come out. Who's going to write it? Well, whoever it is that writes it has to do so in the first person plural. The first person plural is mandatory in such situations. We use this point of view in Persian to show our modesty, to demonstrate our humility. At times, it has to be admitted, we also use it to evade responsibility. But that's another issue. And I wanted to clarify that so that you wouldn't think the we was a royal we, and you wouldn't imagine that it was an editorial we. This is a very specifically Iranian we. And we use the word ma in Persian to sort of disperse the ego. We say, oh, we are so grateful that you were able to come. We are honored that you invited us. And it's a kind of way, in its purest form, of showing humility, but it's also sometimes a wee bit hypocritical, and at times can be, as I said, a way of avoiding responsibility. We didn't know. We were only aware that we were thought there. So all the way through, you can get fluctuations of this different versions of the we. And the other reason I did use this we, was because, and I'm so delighted to hear that there are 40 other books on the subject of the Iranian diaspora on your shelves, but maybe you can tell me whether I'm correct in saying there was plenty of evidence of first-person singular Iranians on the bookshop shelves, but we were not the focus of attention. Subjective stories abounded in the chain stores, but these were not about the real we. They were about individuals we could barely identify with, a country that no longer existed, a past of aesthetic sensibility belonging to the academic few, or a place for the very rich, the very religious, the very feminist, or the anti-feminist, the anti-rich, the anti-religious. There were biographies of those associated with the Peacock Throne or conspiracy theories about the fall of Mossadegh, or the true confessions of those who still remembered our oil in World War II and Hitler, or the fictional memoirs of pivotal figures of the constitutional revolution. But none of these stories actually were about the hydra-headed, contradictory, paradoxical us, the multiple first-person plural us in Toronto and Sydney, in Bogota and Beijing, speaking Persian all over the world. I decided that it was time to write about that paradoxical, contradictory, multiple-faceted us. And so in this book, you're going to discover that us. And one of the other reasons as a writer, I felt a sort of urgency about writing in the first person plural was captured in the words of, if I can find her, Aminata Forno, a marvelous Sierra Leonean Scottish writer. Don't know if you've come across her work. Sierra Leonean, wonderfully black and beautiful, and Scottish, speaking English with a strong Scottish accent. And she wrote the following. The way of literature, she writes, is to seek universality. Writers try to reach beyond those things that divide us, culture, class, gender, race. Given the chance, we would resist classification. I have never met a writer who wishes to be described as a female writer, a gay writer, a black writer, an Asian writer, or an African writer. We would prefer to simply be called writers. And I would add, if one were able, a human being trying to write. That is the greatest accolade. And because I think writers have this capacity for universality and don't necessarily want to be branded, I decided to write a book about the suffocation of branding, really, the impossibility of branding the free human spirit in one single label. And it led me to really wonder why we do have brands. I remember, in fact, the last time I had the privilege of coming to the Library of Congress and was talking about the woman who read too much, I had a conversation with a wonderful friend who's sitting here today, and we were talking about political identity and identity politics and how strongly it is influencing our modern society. And I found myself wondering, why is it so influential in everything we do? And I concluded that it has something to do with the way in which tribalism has sort of married with marketing. And I first came across this phenomenon when my own daughter was going through the passage of adolescence, like so many adolescents wanting to wear black at all times. And I found that there were shops providing for her. It had been industrialized. The Gothic period of puberty had been seized upon by marketing forces and exploited to sell to young, vulnerable people an identity that sort of imposed itself on their individuality. And I thought, but this is happening everywhere. This is happening on all levels of our society. We are using these branding labels to tell us who we are, perhaps because of an anxiety about who we are, perhaps because we fear a kind of erosion of who we are, but it is it is making a commodity of us, I decided. It is truly turning us into a sales object. I wanted to read to you, if I may, the beginning of a chapter in America, where the character Gully finds herself undergoing a lot of stress. I have to find the chapter, excuse me. And she goes, in order to relax and have a bit of calm time, she goes to a pedicure clinic, as it were. This is Los Angeles. This is bimbo blonde Persians worrying about their appearance with nose jobs and so forth. Gully was upset, and her feet knew it. They were in desperate need. That's how the brochure put it. Are your feet in desperate need? And they were. There was a solution, of course, as there was for everything in America. Step inside Pedicure Perfect and we'll change all that, said the brochure. So Gully stepped inside, sat herself down on one of the slippery pink chairs of Pedicure Perfect, and took a deep breath. The girl who was going to change all that was called Cymbeline. The tag on her left breast said so. Americans had this habit of printing or repeating their name everywhere and expecting you to do the same. Gully looked at the spelling for a long time, not sure of the word. She'd heard of American and even Persian girls called Kim, but this sounded like the name of a logging company in Canada or something, or a product to keep household germs at bay, as they said, or a multinational that made sanitary pads. She hoped the girl didn't think she was staring at her breasts. She was only trying not to cry. I want to compare that, if you don't mind, with another little passage, which comes from the experience of the old lady coming to France. And in this chapter, Bibi John finds herself alone in Paris. Her daughter Lily has gone off to be an artiste. Lily is a photographer and takes pictures of nude ladies, which is something her mother seriously does not understand. So Bibi John is left alone, and in order to have a little bit of company, she leaves the apartment, which I have to tell you is an extremely strange place in her mind, because it's up a series of very narrow stairwell going round and round, and she gets to this tiny little apartment on the top floor in the Marais with low ceilings and the smell of drains and everything that a Persian lady would not like to have. So here she is, and she decides to go to the hairdresser and then sit in the park. And she's going to the Place des Vosges, which is, of course, one of the most exquisite places in Paris, 17th century, Louis the Glorious kind of architecture all the way round, which is something she does not see at all. Dimly, through her thick lenses, Bibi saw that one of the benches was partially free, with only a single occupant. She approached it hopefully, but as she drew near, the elderly Frenchwoman sitting in the middle threw such an indignant glance at her that Bibi hesitated. She was only going to sit on the corner, but the woman seemed to think she was intent upon a takeover and making a bid for independence. She was only wearing a Hermès scarf, duty-free, as a protection against frizzy hair, but this apparently made a French colony of her. She pushed the scarf back carefully and tried to smile. But the Frenchwoman looked pointedly away. She had blue-tinted hair that obviously did not frizz, although she may have used the same hairdresser as Bibi. She gave off the air of stale cologne and disapproval as Bibi John sat gingerly down beside her, feeling foreign and resigned. There was nowhere else to sit anyway, given the pile of pigeon droppings at the other end of the bench. So much for her hope of meeting people. Bonjour, she nodded timidly at her neighbour. It sounded like bonjour. She couldn't even get a handle on the accent. The Frenchwoman turned slightly away, ignoring her. In fact, she looked rather nervous, as well as disapproving. And who could blame her, trapped in the middle of a seesaw of a bench with an elderly lady in a headscarf sitting at one end and the pile of pigeon droppings at the other. She sighs because she's thinking about her daughters and the fact that she's a burden on them, and she sighs again. Her French neighbour with tinted hair flinched at the sigh. It was clearly intolerable to hear a foreigner sigh, not only once, but twice, and she must have interpreted it as a criticism towards the Republic, for she rose abruptly at that moment and moved away. Bibi was flustered. She wanted to apologize, but didn't have the words. It was useless anyway because of her accent and the lack of vocabulary. "Oh, Ravon!" she called out faintly as the Frenchwoman turned on her heel and ground across the gravel. But it was clear from the woman's enraged back as she stalked on towards the gate that the effort towards reconciliation and politesse had not been enough. You realize in the course of the story that it is not only the foreigners, however, that treat the Iranians as other, as them. It is the Iranians themselves that treat each other as them. And many a times, it's the Iranians who treat the foreigners as them. We have circles and circles of us and them in the Iranian community, and I thought it might make you laugh, just as a change of voice, to hear the we voice interrupting the story of Bibi John and telling you, from the point of view of a mother-in-law, what she thinks of her daughters-in-law. We have both kinds in our family, the Eastern ones and the Westerners, and we can promise you the first lot cause all the problems, getting into moods at every moment, taking offense at the drop of a hat, forever overreacting to inferences, inventing reasons to be hurt or assuming that we are. So sensitive you can't say a thing to them without risking insult. Communicating with the Farangi girls, that is the foreigners, is frankly much easier. With them, at least you know where you are, in spite of the language barrier. It's straightforward, it's blunt. They say exactly what they mean. Everything is cut and dried with them. But with our Persian daughters-in-law, God help us, we have to walk on eggs the whole time and imagine all the things they aren't saying. In some ways, it's a blessing, of course. It's an advantage that the Farangi don't always understand what we're saying. You know what we mean. At least there's no taarruf with them, no endless compliments, no twisting into insistent knots to say what you don't actually believe. There's none of that with the foreigners. But in other ways, it's hurtful too. You know, they can be quite tactless at times and take candor to such an extreme that you wonder whether they lack imagination or are simply stupid. No courtesies, no compliments, everything at face value. A no is a no, and a yes means they should fix it. Fixing things is what Farangis are good at, but that's where it ends. There you are, half blind, feeling for your cane, and they ask, "Do you need anything?" And of course you say no. And it doesn't go 1 inch further. Of course they bend and pick the cane up for you when it clatters to the floor. That's not the point. But then they go off with a peck on the cheek and a cheerful goodbye, dumping you for the rest of the afternoon, as if the cane was really all that you're not asking for. Well, how can I tell you a little bit more about this story? It could be that you may have looked on the blog site for Stanford University Press, and you may find there are several of the chapters that I've already read on that, and that could be interesting. But there is one that I didn't read, and I might just quickly give you a taste of that. And that's in the end, towards the end of the book, again, when we have a section on marriages, weddings, excuse me. I should have put my little stick-it things on this, but I didn't. Maybe even this would be better. This is a little bit about a reflection on why I've used this structure, in fact. And it's a small chapter called Losing the Plot. And it's about the way in which Iranians write stories. You know, we've got a great tradition of poetry in Iran. We've also got a most fascinating tradition in passion plays and tazieh, but we don't necessarily have the same tradition in novel writing. We don't have that wonderful Western psychological realism tradition, which we have learned, because we're good at imitating. There's a chapter in this book called Imitation, about the way we know how to imitate. But we have borrowed the psychological realism structure of the novel. It doesn't come naturally to the Persian psyche. And in this chapter called Losing the Plot, I explore that idea. The old film ended, as such films do, with a drum roll of a sunset, or was it a sunrise, which faded into the plaintive chant of an opening rose. It was a splendid climax. We like the grand finale of a sunset or a sunrise. We love a film resolving in a rose. All our fears melt with that lovely image. All our hopes blossom with that stirring sound. There's something characteristically Persian, classically Iranian about those symbols. You really can't go wrong with them as far as we're concerned. Of course, there is the reed too, the other metaphor of ours. Yes, we can't do without the reed. More anguished than the rose, more visceral than the sunset, expressive of suffering, of martyrdom, of existential pain in the old poems. Rude hands grasped me, slashed me to the core. Brute fingers plucked me from the soft river floor. Such images are appropriate to our heritage, our religion, our history. They recall the anguish and ardor of the nightingale, that ultimate icon of our culture and our art. They remind us that the golden lion, on whose back the son of the old regime rose and set, bore aloft a curved and cruel scimitar. We're referring to the older regime, naturally, the Qajar regime of the 19th century, the one before the one most people now call old. Or rather, what we used to call old before we became it ourselves. People think that Persians are good at plots. They think we are masters of storytelling. The then and the and then and the and then of Scheherazade. But it's metaphorical logic we prefer. Metaphors are our forte. We love the way metaphors and similes shift and change, ignoring consequence, reversing temporal direction. Conspiracy theories we have no trouble with, but we're not so hot on plot, at least in the narrative sense. What we look for in the film are the roses and the sunsets and the reed. My skin they flayed till I was raw, my lips they split, my throat they cruelly tore. I won't go on because that's just a taste of this book, and it's also an apologia for why I haven't fitted the brand of a normal novel telling you the psychological, realistic story of one individual all the way through to the end. This is a story about a family and a fractured family. It's a story about a whole culture that has been scattered and fractured across the planet. And I do hope that in reading it, you might find something in it that you also associate with. I came across a marvelous statement by Mohsen Hamid, the writer of The Reluctant Fundamentalist, who has also come out with a fascinating book called Exit West on migrants, which maybe you have on your library shelves. He said, even people who stay in the same place undergo a kind of migration. Through time, everyone is a migrant. And I do hope that this book really does appeal to many other kinds of groups. Aminata Forno, the marvelous Sierra Leonean Scots writer I mentioned, says something about branding which I thought would be useful to remember. Sometimes, she says, we need labels just to be able to describe the thing we're talking about. But labels confirm the limitations of language, and when they are overused, they become limiting. And perhaps the last quote I could use for today is one from marvelous Marilyn Robinson, whom I greatly revere. When people draw a bright line between us and them, she writes, those on the other side of the line are assumed to be unworthy of respect or hearing, and are in fact regarded as a huge problem to the us who presume to judge them. When this assumption takes hold, the definition of community hardens and becomes violently exclusive and defensive. Definitions of us and them begin to contract, and as they shrink and narrow, become increasingly inflamed, more dangerous and inhumane. This tedious pattern has repeated itself endlessly through human history, and it is the end of community and the beginning of tribalism. I think we're all quite aware of the fact that we're living at a time when those definitions have contracted, have hardened, are producing notions of narrowness that divide us from one another. And this has happened before, and we've known it in history, and we have noticed that when there is that recoil, that retraction, that reaction against being open, it is inevitably followed by a kind of turning of the tide, and the wave comes rolling back again, and we find ourselves being far more inclusive. It was a recoil in the 30s, it was an expansion again after the Second World War. I hope we don't have to have another war, but the recoil is certainly building up to a tsunami-type proportions now. I can only hope that we will reach out to each other even more as a result. Certainly, the recoil has been repeated, but so has the positive reaction to it, the desire to be inclusive. If my book can promote that movement even slightly, I will be grateful, and very grateful indeed to have this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakhjavani. We have some opportunity for questions. Mary Jane has a question for you. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much. It was a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I'm wondering, I wonder what you think about another way of looking at labeling. Is it a way of also, in addition, to explaining that which is not easily understood? Because if you have a label, then you can add all kinds of attributes and all kinds of values, judgments, and everything, just to explain the other who doesn't fit into one of the categories that
Yes.
the us or the other
Yes.
has. So can it be also a lazy way of saying, well, why do I have to understand that person? I can just put that person in a box and then
I think you're absolutely right. It's an easy shorthand. It's a form of shorthand. It doesn't have to be nefarious. It's got a kind of innocence to it, a substitute for explaining. But I think that it's been exploited and it's been used to divide. And I think that that's also been, in some ways, the act of separation and distinctiveness of our identities in terms of culture, in terms of gender, have been a necessary process for our society. We've been thrown into each other's laps in a way that never happened before. We were always in our little bubbles until war and colonialism and expansion of empire and exploitation of different have forced us to confront each other. And with the 20th century, I think we find ourselves jostling in these conditions, trying to figure out, so where do I belong? So it's been I've always thought of it as a process of adolescence that we are having to go through. As adolescents, we need to define ourselves from our families, from our siblings, to distinguish ourselves as individuals. It's very healthy to do so. And I think we have and are in the process of doing that. But I think you can see the beginning signs of where it becomes what Marilyn Robinson is describing, and then the laziness becomes dangerous. And then we begin to need to question how far we can push that, how far we can let it just go, because we need to have more that unites while keeping our distinction than more that differentiates. Yes. Yes, please.
I just finished an article on assimilation for an encyclopedia, and so one of the things, as you were just speaking, that I wondered about, there's the question of who is defining the universal, right? There isn't a branding. If there is this universal, is it an expansive universal, or is it a universal that is like the colonial powers understanding the universal? And then how do people react to that? And one of the ideas that I was reading a lot about as I was working on this encyclopedia article, and I'm curious as to whether this rings true in some way to you, not as a good thing, but as like an accurate description, is that if part of what you're struggling with is how to retain a sense of a cultural identity from whatever piece of the bubble mattered in this new place, consumption, and therefore kind of
Marketing and commodifying.
Is a really easy, quantifiable way to do it. I can be, I don't know, like I am the daughter of the Ferengi daughter-in-law, right?
That's fine.
And so I can be here in my mother's culture, except when I want to, I don't know, put on a salwar kameez or something like that, and buy a piece of my father's culture and wear it until I want to take it off again, right? So that I can go back to being, and that would be true too if I weren't the daughter of the Ferengi daughter-in-law,
That's right.
But like if I were one of my cousins, the child of two immigrants. And so it's like, it's this way, and it doesn't really work because it's not necessarily, but I'm wondering if that makes sense, this tension, push and pull.
Yes, yes. Well, I think what you're describing is something all immigrants have done, putting the hat on, taking it off, wearing this costume when we're in this group, taking it off when we're in another. But I do believe wholeheartedly in the organic process of civilization. I think the human species has extraordinary capacities to absorb and to, maybe it's because I look at what the English language has done. It is an absorbing process that happens in language, and that is an extension of the human mind. It's what's going on up here in the neurons, the new patterns and pathways that we're creating. The English language has this way of sucking in all the differences. There is no universal culture that is imposing itself on the new word. It is that word that is influencing the use of the language as a whole. And so I don't think it's either, you get imposed upon or you impose. I think there is an organic process going on here. And I think the artificial divisions of colonialism and even industrialization and commodifying, these are artificial processes to buy and sell. There is a buyer and a seller. So long as we can shift the focus so that everybody is selling and everybody is buying, if we're going to use that metaphor, it has to be more organic. It has to flow across the boundaries. I wrote a chapter in here about assimilation. It's called Assimilation. And it starts off with a newcomer from Iran confronting Iranians who have been out of the country for a long time. And when she first comes, she's very anxious to be accepted by the old comers. So she's trying very hard to be terribly modern and secular and disregarding what is in Iran and identifying herself as totally atheist and non-connected with Islam, as it were. And as the story progresses, I don't want to give the game away completely, but we see the shift in her assimilation. And we see her assimilation affecting the fact that she's out of the country is affecting her. It's affecting her interlocutors as well. Their position is being altered by her reactions to being abroad. And so it's that osmosis which I think is interesting, and the constant reminder that we are not mechanical creatures. We're not parts of some artificial organism. We are an organism. We're not man-made. We have the capacity to change extraordinarily and to affect change. So I don't know who the universal us is going to be. I don't know what the universal language is going to be. I hope it's a little bit more interesting than globish is at the moment. But you know what I mean? I have hope that we could perhaps enrich rather than impoverish who we are.
Go ahead. The front.
I have
Eve,
two quick comments and then a question. One of the comments is I was just calling Aminata Thurman's name before you came in here.
Oh.
So I see that I would like her to be part of the conversations with African poets and writers, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
And the second thing I was going to say is that, in many ways, what you were describing is a universal feeling, not just particularly in the acceptance of people in France.
Yes.
That everybody who's gone to France has undergone that.
Yes,
But-
absolutely. Well,
I know they always pretend like they don't understand what I'm saying at all and kind of look at me quizzically.
they?
Yes. But
Yeah.
I have a question that I've always wondered. I have a lot of Iranian friends in the diaspora who only associate themselves with being Persian but not being Iranian. What is that phenomenon where they're not associating with the country but with an ancient culture?
Well, somebody asked me that same question when I was in San Francisco, and it really is interesting that we've subdivided Iran and Persia, but bear in mind that Persia was also the name of the country before it, and there have been fluctuations in the historical naming of this land. I don't know. I think the people who prefer to call themselves Persian are making a branding statement about their non-identification with the present regime. People have all kinds of reasons for why they put Cymbeline on their left breast. So I don't know. I went through a period where I liked being called Persian because I liked the sound, and I remember the little pink country on the map when I was growing up, and it was called Persia, But it wasn't necessarily for political reasons. It was because of But I think you're right. We associate the word Persia with Nightingale's roses, music, literature, and we imagine that Iran does not mean that. But I've similarly come across young Iranians, and very often they're young, not necessarily only young, but who are very, very patriotic about the word Iran and the greatness of Iran and the glory of the past civilizations of Iran. So, they were also being proudly Iranian, and it had nothing to do with the present regime. So I think it really depends on the temperament, the personality, whoever it happens to be. We're always looking for identity, and I think this is the whole issue. Is our identity actually helping others also be included, or are we making a statement that excludes, or is this just a phase, or, it's all good, so long as it doesn't make us feel nervous about anybody. Yes.
Yes, you asked about, I looked in the catalog, and your book is cataloged under Iranian Americans. It didn't include France.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yeah.
the catalogers classify books according to what the content mainly is about. And this is what kind of brings to me, from what you're saying, that people kind of
Label, yeah.
according to what they mainly are about. Now, if you actually look on those books, there are minute shades shades of difference across the meaning of those books on the shelf. And this would be true of yours. It covers a unique slice. And this is what I think is interesting about this whole process is that I'm kind of a logic type. And if I set up a syllogism, Iranians like mirrors, you're Iranian, you must like mirrors. Wrong.
Wrong. Yes.
That you get into these problems, and this is where I think there's some kind of
Yes.
conflict, and I don't know how you see this with the, I think you address it well in the beauty parlor, that this person perceives some kind of other, and then doesn't like that because of the labeling.
Well, I think the labeling, I myself have been constantly shifting around, not knowing how to be branded. I mean, I get branded by the publisher. You know, they want to fix the label on you. So the woman who read too much suddenly became a feminist novel. You know. Or I become an Iranian writer because I happen to be speaking about Qajar Iran. You know. And I think the genre categories in bookshops force you into these little pockets. And this is this is a new phenomenon. This is about trying desperately to sell books. You know, 150 years ago, we never had these categorizations. We were just trying to write and writing about what we knew. Can you imagine Jane Austen being labeled? You know, I mean, first of all, she would have cringed at even the thought of being identified, you know, on a market shelf sort of thing. But I think this is something we have to question because it goes very deep into our politics, how money is influencing our choices of who we are, or who we elect, or what kind of country we want to have. It's so profoundly deep in our society at the moment, everywhere, including France. So, yeah.
You had a question. Go ahead.
I think you kind of answered it in your last remarks. I was just thinking how much economic relations and
Yes.
privileges actually play a huge role.
Yeah.
You know what you said in common things that unite us
And divide us. Yeah.
both within the Persian community or any immigrants community, and also within the larger community. You know, for example, one of the reasons that many perhaps ordinary people kind of despise migrants is because they're told that they come and get the jobs and use all the services and I kind of I lived in England for many years and this was even the sort of political marketing tool even then
Before Brexit, yes. Yep.
and and the fact is that there is major economic inequalities
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that is actually could be the heart of many problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how much of that is really affecting how we view other human beings? and how we
Exactly.
treat them.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we are desperate, if we are, we have difficulties making the ends meet, then it's very much easy to find, sort of people who think might be responsible.
Right.
And, take your fight against them.
Yes. I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that because economics is fundamental to this story. And you see people who have had a great deal who lose everything, and people who have a great deal but don't feel connected to those that don't have in the same community. And I particularly wanted to look at the way in which people who have had a lot and lose everything react to that. Some who spend the rest of their lives in mourning and in lamentation for what could have been and what was, and others who pull themselves up by their socks and become something new and create a new creation out of themselves as a result of this deprivation and this loss and this shaking up and separation from all that is familiar. And in particular, I've been fascinated by how that affects the women here. I hope that doesn't make me a feminist, but I really have been interested because in traditional Iranian society, women, especially in the wealthy sector, were ornaments and were there to grace the lapel of the family. But when they find themselves deprived of everything and have to end up working in a supermarket and through toil and hard work getting their kids raised. That's strength of character, and that's reality in who they are. It's not their brand, it's their strength inside. And I was hoping to break through the us and them in order to show that inner strength. This is a book called Us and Them, with the ampersand in the middle connected to the word us and them. It's not us versus them. It's not us or them. It's not even us, gap, and gap, them. It's us and them, and it's not us and them. Otherwise, it would be about American ideas. So I hope that that new word that combines the two illustrates the sort of strength that, you know, that we need to be able to rise above these and to bring together the extremes that are pulling our societies apart. Yeah. But there's one other, yeah. Two more, yes. Yes.
I was wondering as you were talking, because it was absolutely fascinating, that sometimes those who lead, those who move from, as you just pointed out, from one label
Yes.
to another label.
Yes.
And then the first label, like being an ornament on the lapel
Yeah.
of the family, okay, is one label which is confining,
Yeah.
which actually limits
Yeah.
the abilities of an individual
To
grow
flower,
and
yeah,
develop.
yeah.
And actually moving into the other label might be a growing experience.
Exactly. And that's the beautiful irony, you know. You find that the deprivation is actually the opportunity for growth. Yes, yeah. Sometimes, yes. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very informative, fascinating talk and perspective. I think your ideas resonate very, very strongly with much of the creative and sort of cultural study discourses in Africa in particular, parts of the African diaspora. And I was reminded, as you were talking of the work of Stuart Hall, who is one of the pioneers of cultural studies in Britain, and where he basically argues for this notion, this imperative of breaking free of these strictures, you know, these branding, labels, and so on and so forth, based primarily on the notion of this fluidity of identities, identities not being eternal, not being made once and for all, but constantly
Changing.
in the process of becoming, process of changing. And but at the same time, he also makes the point that, you know, identities do come from somewhere. They are rooted, you know. And Senghor, the first president of Senegal, who was one of the leaders of the Negligent movement, also had this notion of what he calls the civilisation de l'universel, that is the civilization of the universal, based again on the idea of what he calls enracinement, which is rootedness, and ouverture, which is opening. And this is something that you see to a large extent animating much of the discourses around identities in Africa today, particularly among some of the younger writers.
Right.
So I was wondering, because I'm very much interested in film, whether these dynamics, the idea of breaking free of these labels and this dichotomy, these polar opposites of us and them, whether these are also manifest in the cinema.
That's so interesting. First of all, I must say that universal element, the rootedness that not the universal, the rootedness in our identity, I've played with that through the metaphor of smells in this book. So all the way through, you've got a thread of fenugreek. You know, wherever you happen to go, there is Persian chambelile. And that it does not change no matter which country you're in or anything else. It becomes the symbol of that thing which keeps us always Persian or Iranian. But what you said about Iranian film, I think, is so important and so interesting. In that chapter that I read a little bit of, called Losing the Plot, at the end of that chapter, because it starts, if you recall, about a film. It says, the old film ended, as most of these old films do, with a sunset and a rose. And it ends up talking about modern film, modern Iranian film. And you realize that the voice of the we here, as clearly distinguished right at the beginning, that we are old. The old we has great difficulty with modern Iranian film. And, and the reason for it is, maybe I could just read one little tiny paragraph to clarify what I mean, or is there no time? There's no time. Right, you have to read the book, and then we can...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.